kind of stuff the past few days, trying to get over it, drinking emergency and
there you go.
Whatnot.
Well, the good news is you may have a jump on the winter flu then.
That's the good news, huh?
Yeah.
This episode of Bourbon Pursuit is made possible through listeners like you, supported through Patreon. Hey everyone, here we are, first episode of 2018, and we've got some great podcasts lined up this year, and we are pleased to tell you that we are going to be bringing you the Kentucky Derby Legend Series once again. This is where we get to sit in the audience and listen to Fred Minnick interview some bourbon icons. Remember, these podcasts won't air for quite some time after the series has come to a close, so be sure to see it in person by getting your tickets at derbymuseum.org. Thank you to all the new people that have signed up in the past week for sponsoring this podcast on Patreon. I hope that many more of you take that 2018 pledge to help support some of your favorite entertainment, because the monthly donation goes a long way in keeping this podcast running. Plus, we are only a little bit away from the point of actually giving away a free bottle of bourbon every single month. So visit patreon.com, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit, and donate $5 or more per month to get entered into the monthly drawing. As a reminder, please fill out our audience survey. It only takes 3 minutes and gets you entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card. Go to bourbonpursuit.com/survey and select all the brands that you've learned about because of this show. With that, enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast, the official podcast of bourbon, also the #1 podcast of bourbon if you're searching on iTunes. And today it's just Kenny here, and I'm riding solo. And you know, I was actually talking to our guest before we started hitting the record button, and we've had a lot of different master distillers on the show before, and it's always an interesting idea when we have to try to figure out, well, what questions can we ask this time? And I've been meaning to really gauge our audience, you know, and that's kind of what we've been doing a lot lately is trying to figure out how can we kind of crowdsource this a little bit more and have more of our audience be bigger participants. So I put out a question on Facebook today that said, if you could ask a master distiller one question, what would it be? And so we're going to take a lot of those into consideration today when we're going through this. We've also had somebody else on the show that was from this prior distillery as well. And so I think this is a good segue into going ahead and introducing our guests. So today we have Shane Baker. Shane is the master distiller at Wilderness Trail Distillery. And so Shane, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, cool. So, before we begin and talk about Wilderness Trail, about bourbon and master distilling, where did you get your start, and what kind of got you into whiskey business or anything like that in general?
Well, believe it or not, it goes back to even before I was born. My family has been in distilling here in Kentucky for quite a while. My grandmother actually met my grandfather. She was 14 and he was 16, and they met at Kentucky River Distilling in Jessamine County. So that's where they both worked back in that time. So if it hadn't been for whiskey, they wouldn't have come together. My mom wouldn't have been born, and I wouldn't have been here. So it goes back as far as that. But honestly, my grandmother, she started there and she retired from Stitzer Weller up in Louisville when they shut the facility down. So she spent her entire career there. And honestly, whiskey has been a part of my life growing up. I mean, we used to go to her house and there was always just, sample bottles or cases of bottles or special bottles. And we would go to the Kentucky Derby with her, and she would be dressed up like Johnny Walker. She was always doing these industry trade things that now, I find myself and our teams doing the same exact thing. So it goes back as that. My career, path wasn't initially in that. I didn't stay on the whiskey nipple, if you will, from that to on. I went on kind of into an engineering path, and I'm a mechanical engineer by trade. And so I started off as what most people do, looking for a job. and when I got out of school. And so I went from IBM to Toyota and some different places. And all the time, you're networking, you're learning how to do things. And one of my fortuitous crossroads, if you will, was running in who is now Dr. Patrick Heist. He wasn't doctor back then. He was just our lead singer in our rock band. So,
that's pretty funny.
Yeah. So I watched him kind of going through school. I was kind of, had a career job, and we were trying to make the go of the rock band, but always talking about whiskey and Kentucky bourbon, and leaning back on some of my family's experiences, and looking at old bottles, and I seen that he shared the same passion I did, and so that ultimately led to us coming together, forming Ferm-Solutions over a decade ago, and then ultimately getting enough cash in our pockets to start the distillery. So it's kind of a cool path.
So let's go a little bit back in your history right there. So, you said your mom worked at Stitzel. What was she doing there during that time?
So my grandmother retired as the warehouseman. She was the controller over all of the barrels at Stitzel. So you can go there today and ask the gentleman who used to work there. He's still at the guard, security guard.
Mr. Perry, right? Yeah.
Yep. Just ask for Doris Ballard, and he will remember her. She was a sparky lady, always telling jokes, but she was in charge of all the barrels. And really an interesting thing to her, when she started working at such a young age, obviously she had to quit school to go to work at that time. And one of the things that my grandfather outlined was, hey, you got to get an education. You can't go work for this distillery. And but she was a whiz bang at math, and just she really impressed them in a summer job. And so they committed to, I guess me and my great grandfather, that they would provide her the best education that they could. And she ultimately ended up being controller over one of the most famous distilleries in the United States.
Well, that's impressive. I mean, and so that was your kind of, I guess, your family lineage into it. Is any other lineage into the whiskey too?
Well, uniquely, when my grandmother obviously worked there, my entire family worked there. So that's about anybody connected in that. But outside of that, living here in Kentucky, living and breathing the Kentucky air, you just have bourbon in your lungs. And so it's always been a part of what I wanted to do, and really a part of the day to day, because, we live here, and often we sometimes take that for granted. I see people all the time, like in Lexington, and I'm like, how many times you been to Keeneland? And they're like, I've never been there.
It's a Lexington staple, right?
Exactly. So we sometimes take those things for granted, but I think, growing up in it, was constantly reminded of how impactful and important the bourbon industry has been to Kentucky, and a lot of jobs and a lot of growth.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and we'll talk about Wilderness Trail for a second. So, you kind of segued into it, talked about how, your mechanical engineering path led you into Pat Heist, who was another previous guest on the show that did a big deep dive into yeast strains and, fermentation and some other kind of cool stuff. So what kind of got to the point where you said, okay, well, I guess let's just start distilling and see what happens?
Well, uniquely, that's what we wanted to do first. We looked at it, I have a good engineering and business background, and we looked at it, we put together our business plan, and we put our two families, worth of jars together, and we're like, hey, we can't afford this. And if we can, we're not going to make our mark. We're not going to be, have enough to put back, the production. We can buy equipment, but we won't have any money to put it back any barrels. And so it's a huge investment. So it really was kind of at the time when we said, hey, we want to stay involved in this industry. We want to ultimately get there. And how can we do that short of just go getting a job at a distillery? And being the entrepreneurs that we were, we felt like we could go at a different angle. Ultimately, that was Ferm-Solutions that really gave us the aptitude and the fortitude to do Wilderness Trail.
So do you consider yourself a craft distiller in this new movement? Is that where you would categorize yourself?
Absolutely. I think, that word has been abused and used and maybe criticized in a lot of things, but I can use that word simply because I personally am involved in every part of our distillery. I submitted the federal application. I created the mash bills. I'm over tasting things off the still. When somebody needs something, it's coming to us. And all of that is not from a playbook. I mean, we're problem solving real time. We're understanding our business. We know where we're going. We're trying to put the pieces to get there. So, all of that really takes, an art and craftsmanship and a lot of hard work to get there. And I think, when you're at that level, no one's doing this for us. We consider ourselves part of the craft industry.
And if memory serves me correct, you guys are located around Danville, Kentucky, right?
Yes, correct. Just south of Lexington.
So how big's the operation right now? Is it tour? I mean, you're going live with tours. Like what do you expect when you start rolling into Wilderness Trail?
Well, right now it's rather unique because we're at our new location, which we actually relocated here about a year and a half out off Lebanon Road. And so you would come here and you would see we're nestled on 34 acres of rolling bluegrass. We've got the Forkland knobs out in front of us. So it's very picturesque. It's a beautiful sight. It's extremely peaceful out here. So as soon as you pull onto our grounds, you've got this just awesome feeling that you want to hang out and just see what else there is to learn. From there, you would see on the onset our large rick houses. So we've got a 10,000 barrel rick house right off of the road as you're coming up our drive. So that starts giving you a sense that, hey, there's something going on here. And then you see kind of the main distillery. We've got a beautiful old home built in 1859 that serves as our visitor center. And then scattered around that are more rick houses and bottling warehouses. And so, we're giving tours Tuesday through Saturday, every hour on the hour. And we're a part of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail Craft Tour. This year already to date, we've penciled in about 55,000 visitors to little old Danville here. And part of that actually facetiously was due to 28,000 people here for the Kentucky State Barbecue Festival just a weekend or two ago. So there was definitely controlled chaos while that was going on.
Well, nothing like, having some ribs and some brisket and sitting back, sipping some whiskey, right? So
yeah, listening to some music. It was an awesome event. But our tours give you a really kind of an insight view behind the scenes, if you will. Not to really the standard tour of, hey, bourbon, 2% corn, blah, blah, blah. By the time people have gotten here, we often find that they've been on several tours. And so we want to give them an experience that they really remember. And basically that comes down to, showing kind of the science side behind the operation. Where do we work with the yeast? Where do we work with actually our own quality? How do we do those things? And then you get hands into our milling, to our cooking, to our fermenting, and then right up in your face, you can get an opportunity to see distillation. And even if you're lucky, there might be some samples coming back from the rick house on those days. So those are definitely good days to be on the tours. So, but beyond that, there's also a lot of dirt turned over. We're massively in construction right now.
who isn't?
Yeah, I was gonna say we've been in construction for the past 6 years, and it doesn't have any end in sight. But as soon as we get a good plot of green grass, we turn it over. And so right now we're actually building an additional 20,000 barrel warehouse, and we're also expanding the distillery. I'm actually staring at the hole in the ground, which is the home of the fermentation building. So we're actually dropping in an additional 36-inch column, 6 new 20,000 gallon fermenters, 2 new 10,000 gallon cookers, and taking our production from 30 barrels a day to 140 barrels a day. So we've got some considerable construction going on right now.
So you're looking at almost 2.5 to 3x, increase of size of everything you got going on. Are you thinking of are you running 8 hours a day, 24 hours a day? Like what's the future aspect right there?
Yeah. So what led us to that is a couple of things. One, we're already running around the clock and maximizing current equipment, which we have an 18-inch column that runs, about 10 gallons a minute. The new still runs about 40 gallons a minute. So it really comes down to a couple of things. One, we're getting in a better position of paying back our initial investment to kind of move our paychecks, if you will. I mean, we're self-funded. Again, we're just a family-owned operation. So Ferm-Solutions, as it grows, we simply cash those checks into whiskey barrels. And so where we're at is we're now able to, put back more whiskey as we're looking out in advance of our brand growing. We're hoping we're laying down the stock that's going to be ready in 10 years, those type of things. And so that is really helping us, the expansion, as well as we've actually started taking on a little bit of contract production for some other brands. And we've seen that as a great opportunity, not only to help with our production, but also expand at the same time.
I mean, I've seen that a lot just in the industry in general. It seems that if somebody is starting up a new craft distillery, they are not doing their own spirits anymore. I mean, they take advantage of being able to do contract distilling only because, you can maximize the amount of profit that you can get out of these stills. And it seems that people are more than happy to sit there and start contracting it out, start creating their own labels, waiting time, sourcing your MGP, whatever they need to do to actually start turning over money. So it seems like a pretty solid business plan that a lot of people are going through right now.
Absolutely. I mean, the irony is, years ago we had the option of either taking our investment in starting Ferm-Solutions, or taking our investment in doing what a large part of the fledgling side of our industry, which is go buy barrels, sit on it, try to get that brand growing until you get on your feet, and then, go build your distillery. And the fallacy in that plan for us is it wouldn't have been ours. I mean, we take pride in the grain that we use, which is from Kessell, and it's all grade corn. So, we take pride in the yeast that we use and the mash bills that we created. And we just didn't see any path that the current market could emulate that. So that just didn't work for us. But it does work for a lot of other people who may be just less or just new to the industry, trying to get in on the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, there's got to be you got to have a different angle on it too, right? And so,
absolutely.
One thing we had Pat on, he talked about all the different kinds of yeast that you guys have. And, you didn't mention the type of corn, but I mean, what other kind of things that are you all doing at Wilderness Trail that kind of sets you apart or makes you a little bit unique and maybe stand out from the crowd a little bit?
Oh, there's several things. One is the grain that we use. We don't pull our grain from an open elevator or a consolidated elevator. I could take you to the plot of ground that our grains are grown on, and they're able to grow with us. I mean, they're growing close to 2,000 acres this coming year. So the importance of that is they're a seed farmer. So other farmers buy their seed to grow their grains from these guys. And so it's all controlled pollination, and not to get technical, it means consistent flavor. So one advantage for us is that consistent flavor that comes from our grains. Number two, we use a sweet mash infusion cooking process. And that is different than the typical sour mash that you hear all the time. But the sweet mash process is just known to create a softer, sweeter distillate. And by using infusion mashing, we're able to keep all of that intact and create such a soft, proper distillate that literally our 135 off the still is like drinking some people's 90 proof. I mean, it is just that smooth. And so I think our sweet mash and which is just basically our process, infusion mashing on our cooking. And then lastly, we are actually the first in the industry to be chemical free, which means that our boiler is actually a pharmaceutical grade boiler from Sellers Engineering, built right here in Danville. And it's called a clean steam, which means if I were to give you a glass of our clean steam, no chemical added boiler, and let's say some condensate from another boiler, what would you drink? And I'm not just saying that to say, hey, there's put fear into things. Boiler chemicals are safe. They're food grade. They're there to reduce scale, which we have very hard water here in Kentucky. But what that is there's a taste there. And what you taste in our spirit is pure Kentucky water. And we feel that our sweet mash, our infusion mashing, and our clean steam process, because our cook process is direct injected steam, distillation in our column still, direct injected steam. So what we're drinking, part of that is steam condensate, what came out of that boiler. And we feel all of those things combined completely set us apart. And we've had, a lot of people come in and validate that right off the still as well as out of the barrels.
So we've talked about the difference between sweet mash and sour mash on the show before. Sweet mash is basically, you clean everything out. You have all new ingredients every single time, and you're not reusing part of the mash that was there before. But infusion mash is something that I've never particularly heard of before. Can you explain a little bit more about what infusion mashing really is?
Absolutely. Infusion mashing simply means that we cook all of our grains at the proper gelatinization temperature, which means that, let's say corn, if you were to cook corn, and the purpose of gelatinization is to convert those starches into sugars, kind of get those lines of chains breaking down. And when you look at corn actually gelatinizes at 178 to 180 degrees. We cook our corn up to 190 degrees. And so that BTPE, which is just a letter for, how much of that gelatinization did we come up with? We cook up to that temperature. Let's say our small grains, the gelatinization temperature for our wheats or our rye are in the 150 and 160 range. Our malts being, 140 to 145 range. So if we were to cook those grains at a higher temperature, which there's an industry norm, and this is where we get involved a lot on the Ferm-Solutions side, but there's an industry norm just to boil the hell out of the grains. And while that may be easy and people are thinking about sterilization and different things, they're missing the boat on quality, because you create unbranched chain amino acids when you degrade things by boiling them or cooking them beyond their temperature. So it's kind of like, cooking cornbread in the pan. If it gets too hot, you're going to burn that, and you're going to alter the flavor of what is in there. And so what we're trying to do by creating branched chain amino acids, that is what our yeast are consuming to turn into that soft spirit. So it's kind of like we are what we eat. We want to give our yeast exactly what they need to make ethyl alcohol, and not a lot more fusels, which are a lot of the higher alcohols. And they get that from unbranched chain amino acids. So in summary, it comes back to we're properly cooking our grains. We're not overcooking them. We're not wasting energy to do that. We're using the right amount of energy to gelatinize our grains at the right temperature. And so that's infusion mashing.
So what's the temperature that it is before you're considered burning at that point? And then how does that compare? You said it was like around, you guys do 190, but you said industry standard was like 170, 180 or something like that?
No. Industry standard would be to boil that. So they would take it up to 212 degrees.
Okay.
210. So by taking it beyond that proper gelatinization temperature, that's when you start degrading the grains at that point. So very simply, any temperature higher than the actual gelatinization temperature would be in a degradation zone.
And is it makes it a longer process, same amount of time? Is it?
Actually, if anything, it's a shorter process, because let's say we're heating up our cooker, we got a 4,000 gallon cooker. It's going to take us longer to heat that to 212 degrees than it would be to 190. So it's actually less time. We're not wasting energy. We actually got Kentucky Manufacturer of the Year for the utilization of energy, as well as our greenness. We're a zero discharge facility, but really it comes down to we're properly using energy and recycling energy inside of our facility to save on the environment and make a damn good whiskey at the same time.
That's a pretty interesting kind of angle I want to take on that too, because we've always had people that want to talk about, the sustainability of bourbon, like what is green bourbon and all this other kind of stuff, right? So kind of talk about what you're doing in regards of that, when you say zero discharge and being able to take energy that's being produced off something and transfer it to something else.
Yeah. So very simply, obviously in terms of the environment, we utilize part of that environment. We utilize a lot of water in our process. We utilize a lot of energy, so that energy is obviously being produced somewhere. And so, for example, we created a coil system that we put inside of our stillage tank. So the stillage that comes out of the bottom of the still is 200 and something degrees. It's spent grains that's going into our stillage, our spent tank. And so that heats up that coil and gives us free hot water. So all of the hot water, all of our processed water that we use is heated by the actual stillage that we've already, distilled. So we're reclaiming that energy and that heat. For example, when we do our cook process, instead of bringing all of our water up to temperature, we actually do an old German technique to where we cook very thick on the onset. And then we use that balance of that water to use it to help cool it down. So in essence, our chiller does not even kick on to start cooling our cooker until we're within the last 15 to 20 minutes of the process. We use actually cold water on the onset of each of those additions to cool that tank down. So again, we're using less energy all the way around, which is better for the environment. And then also in terms of any discharge, we collect our condensate that comes out of our doubler. We create that in a hot water tank. We use that hot water back into our cook process. All of our waste products, which is our stillage, goes to a local farmer and feeds, about now, I think 500 or 600 head of cattle. So, that's totally sustainable in terms of actually part of that farm is where part of our corn is grown. So it's kind of, that goes into full loop. But it's really about us utilizing good engineering to accomplish the task with lower cost. And that's why, when we look at the industry, we're ready for the industry, whatever the industry is. We plan on being around for 100 years or more. And so looking out ahead of us, we have a competitive advantage in terms of how we're producing our whiskeys.
And I think it would come even more full circle if that farmer brought you a few T-bones just to say thank you, right?
Now that, I agree with. Yeah, because he's always looking for what his corn's producing. So
absolutely. So another question for you. Either when you're thinking about you're making batches or looking at barrels or anything like that, like do you find that doing the batch and the mash process is always very consistent? However, it's the final product that's either in the barrel or something else that you kind of like say like this one's more special than the next or something like that? Or do you think you can really pinpoint it during say like the mash process?
Well, it's unique that we see it actually on both ends. For example, to answer one question, what we do see, which is what we really strive for here, is consistency. And it is definitely one thing that the column still does for you. You feed it properly and you do things on the front end of the process, such as cooking properly each time consistently, fermentation is consistent, you'll end up with a very, very consistent tasting distillate. So we have that consistency out of the gate. Uniquely, we can change that consistency by simply changing our yeast, changing our mash bill, changing how we bring stuff off the still. So, that's very unique in terms of how we can do that. But in the whiskeys we make, we make basically 3 different whiskeys. We make a wheated bourbon, a rye-based bourbon, and a rye whiskey. And each of those 3 whiskeys are extremely consistent coming across the still. And that's where, for example, Pat brings a lot of things to the plate to where that quality control, to where, he's responsible for, basically what's going on in the lab. Are a yeast happy? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they creating something right or wrong? And then that's where what we see is we are constantly, just flatline. It's almost like Groundhog Day. So boring because it's the same, and that's really what we want to see. But where we do see the biggest variances, which you pointed out, is when we start tasting in the barrels. We use Independent Stave Company for our barrels. And while you would think, every barrel is going to be off of the lot, the barrel sitting right next to the barrel on the truck, literally we've done tests like that. They can be dramatically different, even coming down the production line and maybe even sharing some wood from the same tree. We've seen differences and variances in that. So the barrel does, what I think the industry has always said. I don't think it's the 80-20, but it's definitely a 60-40 with the barrel in favor of really shaping bourbon into what it becomes.
Good. I'm glad to hear somebody that has a stance and good opinion on it, because everybody's like, that's something I'm not going to touch with a 10-foot pole and put my my stance behind it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's reality. We're the guys with the science. So we've kind of been known as the myth busters in the industry. We do a lot of research, and if any paralysis by analysis around here, and again, you hang out with Pat long enough, and you'll see the desk is piled high full of papers where we're analyzing what we just analyzed, and because usually when you start digging, you start finding more questions, and it leads to more knowledge and more answers. And I think we've done a good job of that with a lot of our collaboration. University of Kentucky set the boat over there as a great program to where we're looking at, wood studies and different things. And we're learning a lot right now. It's amazing how old this industry is, and yet we're still learning a lot about maturing spirits and barrels.
So, we had Pat on before, and I don't remember exactly how many the number was, 200 or 600 different yeast strains you guys have, or something like that going on.
Yeah.
I know it's up there. But when you talk about, you have your wheated, you have your rye bourbon, and then you got your rye whiskey. Are you using the same yeast strain in all of them? Are you kind of mixing and kind of experimenting right now, or you think you guys have really like dialed it down? You know exactly what your percentages are and all that other kind of stuff.
Well, believe it or not, we actually use, and I'll just exclude contract production, because contract production, we would allow someone to choose their yeast strain. So, if you throw that in the mix, we could be using up to 20 different yeast strains. But we really use 4 different yeast strains. Because beyond our 3 whiskeys, we also make rum, which we use a particular yeast strain for. And our 3 whiskeys, we actually use different yeast for. And our vodka comes from our wheated bourbon distillate. So that kind of shares the same yeast at what we use for that.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess kind of going on to this a little bit more. This was another good question that came up, and this is more or less along the lines of like the source of the grains. So Adam Kessell asks, he says, I'd like to hear about crop yield and the agricultural footprint that bourbon and whiskey kind of has, and what safeguards are being put on for, say, like long-term success, making sure crops are always going to be, supplied and everything like that.
Very good question. Honestly, that particular question was a big project for us this year as we prepare for our expansion next year. So, we have been with Cavendale since day one. And obviously they grew a certain amount of grains. We started looking at the amount of grains that we were going to, from 100 and actually from 200 bushels a day to over 1,000 bushels a day. Everybody's eyebrows were raising up on how can we sustain this and still keep it local and so on. And so really that came down to, go back 4 or 5 years ago, when we actually selected the varietals of grains that we're using. We selected those for flavor and yield. So we know that the seed that we spec that is going to be grown is going to yield that 180 to 200 bushel, per acre type of yield, which means that from an economical sense, that's going to be right in line with what we want from our farmer on the corn. When we started looking at, okay, hey, how much can you grow? We ended up having to say, we got to pull in some more local farmers. And fortunately, we're right here in Boyle County to where, we've been on the edge of the bourbon industry, and actually in a lot of cases, either pulling stillage from other distilleries or supplying grains to some of the distilleries. But basically our infrastructure here was ripe to grow for that. And so it was very easy for us to line up a couple of more farmers to pull in all the grains that we need to grow. And each of those farmers were the new farmers that we've added on, we're only using maybe 30% of their capacity, if you will, in terms of growing acreage. So we look at that as to help them grow more. Where the sustainability comes in, by being able to help some of these other farmers now come on board and supply grain, what they're able to do is to now start investing into their farm, to where it's going to be in better shape for the future. They're buying equipment, they're putting up new grain bins, they're creating things that whether they're doing business with us or somebody else, they're going to be able to utilize those assets to keep farming, to keep, that family farm in their name, that type of thing.
So I guess how long do you, or should I say, as a farmer in this industry, and I don't know exactly how much competition that you have with around there in Danville with other distillers or anything like that, but like what is like the amount of ratio of say like farmers to distillers, and not just around you but anywhere else? Do you think that people are starting to feel this strain of increased competition, and now that corn itself might be a hotter commodity than it was 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, uniquely the gorilla in the distilling industry, the fuel alcohol producers, they already kind of ran that race and created the result that we have today. So back in the fuel alcohol boom, when the renewable fuel standard demanded that 10 to 15% of our petroleum be blended with ethanol, there was a big crush on corn. And bushels went up to $9 a bushel. We couldn't grow enough. There's not enough land in the world. All of these horror stories. And the reality of it is, each that industry has grown, there has been an excess production of corn, to the point that when we do all of our exports, when we do all of our internal U.S., we still have excess surplus supplies of corn. So that's just on the surface of, there are some big commercial farms that, have developed since then that really drive a lot of grain. When you look at it locally, I wouldn't say it's moved really hard in that direction, but more and more farmers are moving from, let's say, I had, used to be a tobacco farmer, and now they're growing grains. And maybe they used to grow a little bit of grains for cattle, but now they're seeing a bigger market in growing, let's say, rye. To grow Kentucky rye right now, a farmer can really make a strong return in terms of a per acre basis. So we actually have about 4 farms around us planting a lot of rye, not only for us, but to sell to other distilleries.
I was about to say, it was because rye isn't really a big commodity here, or it's just not a big thing here in Kentucky. Most of it's up north, right, or Midwest.
Right. Yeah, rye has historically not been a very good Kentucky crop. Wheat, we grow wheat like nobody's business around here. And corn the same way. Rye usually likes a little cooler, drier climate. However, there are some hybrid ryes. There's a Ryman rye and a Kentucky Heritage rye that is basically designed for our climate. And it creates a nice little plump rye. I will have to say, it may not be as pretty as some of those Wisconsin or Minnesota or even Canadian ryes, in the bag. But let me tell you, the taste is there.
Right. That's interesting. So, I guess what's your take on, like, how long, and maybe it's just you all, maybe you could talk about anybody else, but like, at what point does it become, you say like, okay, we just can't do this like whole, farm to bottle thing. We can't do local grains anymore. Like we gotta start sourcing. We gotta make this bigger. What do you think that's inflection point for most companies, or do you think you'll hit it yourself one day?
I think it's regional dependent. For example, we honestly thought that we would be into that territory in 2018. I mean, here we are going from 24, 30 barrels a day on 2 shifts to 150, some odd barrels a day. And so immediately we're like, okay, we're going to start pulling in, rye from here. Where do these guys get it from? We'll kind of look at the same indicator. And then after we actually sit down with our local farmers, we found that, again, here in Boyle County and even some of our surrounding counties, we have the sustainability. We can keep growing even to the size that we grew, and we could probably triple our size and not run into an issue here. But now let's go 35 minutes west of here and to where we're getting into more of a concentration of smaller distilleries and larger distilleries. And I think those are the regions that are, suppressed. They just can't grow it. There's not enough farmers there. There's not enough land there. Or if the demand is just too high. It's not necessarily there's not enough farmers there. It's just there's more demand there than there is supply. So I think it's a regional issue. And when you see new distilleries going up in pockets to where there's already a concentration of distilleries, they're going to experience problems from grain and also getting rid of spent grains. You know, another advantage we have here locally is that all of our farmers in this area, you know, have not really been taking advantage of free spent grains that really puts weight on cattle. It really helps their pocketbook because, you know, it's just too far away almost. So now our local farmers have been and are going to see a big advantage to, you know, even the spent grain side. So I would have to say it's a regional issue, and a new guy coming on board would have to take that into consideration. I mean, it's one thing cool to have Bardstown on the back of your label, but if you can't, you know, run an efficient distillery because of the infrastructure there, then it's more challenging.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I want to talk about that relationship too, right? Because it sounds like you have a relationship with the farmers because, you know, you have to source his grains, you take your off product, you give it to his cows. But you know, and also at some point you might have to turn away a few bushels. You might have to say like, no, this isn't meeting the spec. Like how often do you turn something away? And I guess how do you salvage that relationship or keep that alive too?
Well, that's a good point because it is a relationship. We know Barry and Lee and Clyde, you know, on a first name basis. They're over here hanging out. We're over there. Just recently, Barry Welty, who's one of the head guys over there, he volunteered to cook steaks for our company picnic. So, I mean, beyond just a friendship relationship, you know, we're really good friends with these folks. And I think what that is we're straight shooters. They're straight shooters. If we've got issues, we go to them, we address it, and we solve the problem. So we've never had any issues really to have to worry about that. There has been a time that where, let's say before they started growing some rye or something, that we had them to source the rye for us. And we had and I guess earlier our history, we've rejected one load. And the rye came in, you know, our guys caught a little bit of discoloration. And so from a visual standpoint, we said, hey, we got to get the doctor over here. And, you know, Pat did his little magic thing and we found out, you know, hey, this is concerning with an aflatoxin level. And so we rejected that load. But that's the only time we've ever done it. And it didn't come from our farmer. So, but if it did, and even at that time, we're just like, hey, dude, you got to take this back. We're not going to accept it. And they apologized. So we really, you know, I think as long as you maintain a good working relationship, you know that it's important for both you and the farmer to win. I mean, you know, we're not trying to drag him through the bushes and get everything for free. He's got to make money in order to help us, you know, get our grains. And so I think the valued relationship there is really key. We can agree to disagree and walk away still best friends.
No, I'm with you on that one. So I kind of want to get your opinion on this whole boom that's happening, right? Because I think, you know, we can look around, you can see that, you know, yourselves, every major distiller, everybody's going through massive expansions right now. There is an uptick of people that are getting into this, I don't know, so-called hobby every single day. There are more people drinking bourbon every single day. And there's just a lot of momentum. So from your standpoint and where you sit, what do you think the craft industry needs to do to kind of keep this momentum going?
Age inventory. They've got to age stock. I mean, I love what's going on in the industry. I love the growth. I love the innovation. I love the creativity. I love the pushing the envelope things and, you know, just moving off of center on a few things. But what I think we all enjoy is a good, mature whiskey. And I think it's a double-edged sword in the fact that, you know, in a lot of business models, you know, that's just what you have to do. You either have to go source some older stock or you start off and you go as long as you can until, you know, you can introduce that to the market. And I think what is going to mature in our industry, if it hasn't already started that, is that you can buy damn good bourbons all day long for $20 or $30. And that's because the good guys or the big guys make it good. I mean, they always have and always will. And I think for the craft industry to stay growing and to stay intact, it has got to bring and maintain a quality level equal, if not greater, than the heritage staples in the industry. So I think, it really comes down to, for a good example, and we are blessed and fortunate that we had the opportunity to do our distillery this way, but we've never released a whiskey. And we've never released a whiskey for a reason. It's because it's not matured yet. We're hardcore purists when it comes to not only protecting the brand of Kentucky bourbon, but also I want you to enjoy it and I want you to come back for more. And I don't want it just to be a one night thing, or a flyby. I want it to really be a part of, Kentucky history. And so in doing that, our opinions are, we'll never release a whiskey below 4 years old. It just won't happen. We feel that's the beginning point to where bourbons start really getting good. And so we actually intend to try to age our stock to 6 to 8 years. Next year is our 4-year mark. We're going to do a very limited release, a bottled in bond, again, a good quality statement. But I think that's what the craft industry has got to do more of, is continue to mature towards, just a lot more older stock. I think that's where the industry is going.
Do you think the industry is kind of hurting right now because of, when some people say craft, they're like, I don't know, like craft, right? Like you kind of have this, like, you always have this like young taste to it, right? Because there's plenty of people out there and they'll put something that's only been aged 30 days or 2 years or less than that. And, not only that is it has a very, very high price tag, as you had mentioned, those big guys that have, nice $25, $35 bottles, and it's hard to compete with that. So do you think some of these craft whiskeys have kind of put I don't know want to say a stain on it, but they kind of have turned some consumers off to just the craft industry in general because of releasing unaged product?
Boy, that's a trick question. I may get in trouble for my answers, but I think it's a yes and no. I think there are some excellent craft whiskeys out there. I think there are some bottles that some folks have made on a very small scale that are worth $100 a bottle because they've got that much time, energy, and passion and love in it. I don't discount that at all. And the juice is good. You're going to find in some occasions, hey, that was worth a Pappy Van Winkle bottle, that type of thing. But more often than not, you hear a lot of the horror stories on the other side. And it's because we have been adapted or introduced to very mature bourbons, and now we're all of a sudden being introduced to new whiskeys. And it's different. And maybe, our palates are telling us, hey, this isn't that good. When really, maybe it's a great American whiskey for a 2-year-old instead of our minds comparing it to what we've always drank, which is, 6 and 7 and 8-year-old. And so I think that's where the good and bad is. I think there are some cases where there may be a few, and definitely not a part of the whole, that are trying to capitalize on the industry. They've jetted in, they're trying to make a buck, and they're doing it the fastest way they can. And they're not really worried about if it's going to be there next year. It can come and go, kind of like that hobby that you were talking about. That worries me to a sense because an unknowing consumer could pick that up, great marketing, buy the bottle, and get turned away, like you said. And that's unfortunate because there are so many really good craft whiskeys, small distillers and so on out there. That's a difficult question because it's a tough pill to swallow sometimes.
Absolutely. So I guess we'll take it back a little bit to your distilling right here, and we'll kind of start wrapping up a little bit. So, what mistakes have you all made, and have you learned from thus far in your your journey? Leading into your 4th year, almost getting ready to have one of your first bourbons roll on out here. So, what kind of mistakes that you made that you could share to other craft distillers out there?
One, I think underestimating, like our laydown stock. A great example, I was looking at our gift shop earlier, and there's like 4 bottles of rum sitting there because we're out. We had a mad dash this summer, and we're normally, we only make about 100 barrels of that rum a year. And we typically sell out of that because we aged that for 2 years, and we typically sell out of that close to the holidays. Now, here we are midsummer and we're out. And so one of our biggest mistakes was underestimating, again, where we thought we would be. And so now we're sitting here like, oh, crap, we're going to have to wait 4 months before our next 2-year-old pops to, its birthday. And so literally what's at the stores, and so on is all that we can provide. And we've got orders coming in, daily to fill. So I think that's been probably one of our biggest mistakes. If I could go back 4 years ago, I would have been putting down the kids' college funds and everything in terms of not putting back enough and thinking that, hey, this is going to work for us. So I think, that's one. Two, I would think, some production level mistakes that we've made very simply have been, I think, one, thinking that, hey, we can stretch this weekend out. We don't need to come in and do something. And then we get behind, or it's a maintenance issue. And what you find is, distilling and fermenting is a very scheduled process. When the yeast are finally kind of dying off, you want to get that mash out of that fermenter and into that beer well, because you can pump it. Everything is kind of in suspension. Well, if you go an extra day or two, all of those grains are just going to settle down. About a 9,000 pound plug in the bottom of your tank. So, operationally, I think we've learned to, hey, we knew this. We didn't even learn from our own mistakes. And, but simple stuff like that. I mean, we do a lot of training, and I think we're fortunate that we've got some very skilled distillers, in our team, that we've been lucky with a lot of that stuff. But I think the biggest part is just underestimating where this market can take you and what this industry can do for you.
And I got one more question down you, because you've been distilling Wilderness Trail now for about a year longer, and we've been doing this podcast. And I think when we started doing this podcast is when I really started paying attention to like the weather, right? And so I think about what the past few years have been like during the summer and during the winter, and even come up into this winter. The fall time hasn't actually been cold yet. Last winter, actually, we had maybe like 1 or 2 days of snow. It really wasn't enough time that most people said that is enough time to actually change, turn the weather over in a rick house, right? Because it just wasn't cold enough for 2 weeks. So at this point, what do you think the last, say 2 or 3 years have done in regards to the weather and how that's going to affect some aging bourbon and aging stocks that you all have?
Man, that's a great question. Again, analysis or paralysis by analysis. We have data out our wazoo. We actually track the temperature and humidity on every roll in about 9 different locations in our rick houses. So literally we know, what is the weather outside doing to the inside of the barrel house. And really we're trying to look to see, are we going to end up with that average? We want that average barrel to be, in the mid 70s for a temperature and have a humidity of 60 to 70%. That's why we open and close those windows on the rick houses and all those weird things we do, is really to keep that humidity and that temperature level in that range. And what we have seen, and definitely the data has shown, is the past really 2 years has been warmer winters, warmer springs, and longer falls than in the prior years. And what's unique is, when we go back and look at some of our notes to, let's say, our 1 year, our 2 year, and all the way up now to basically our 4 year stuff, it's amazing that the barrels that we put back, let's say 2 years ago, on a blind panel, sometimes you'll see it setting in the 4 year slot, meaning find the 4-year-old in this flight. And sometimes we'll see a 2.5 or a 3-year-old sitting in that slot because for whatever reason it's aged better, it's aged faster than the same mash bill that we would have been tasting, the year or two prior to that. So it's seemingly, the jury's still out on that. Still a lot of data to collect, but it does seem like the last couple of years the temperatures has stayed more elevated. And from what we've seen, the whiskeys seem like they're maturing along, really well.
Well, good. So I guess the weather hasn't truly affected it too much then.
No. And if anything, I would think it's in kind of a positive way. We still got, really cold But when you look at the mass in barrels and then calculate that to the mass in barrel warehouses, it takes a long time for that temperature variant to change. Literally, it takes months of temperatures to affect that temperature. So a lot of times when it's up and down, it's doing nothing but looking at that average temperature. When you look at that average temperature, that's really the temperature that the barrels are going to.
Well, awesome. So Shane, I want to say thank you so much for being on the show today. This was fantastic. Understanding more, not only just about Wilderness Trail, about, the knowledge that you have, more about the industry, more about your views on the craft business and how this is going to be affecting, long term, and, the bump on the radar that you all can be able to give the industry and stuff like that too. So I want to let you give a plug out for, where you all are located. When's your stuff going to be ready? Where people can find out more about you, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Come to KentuckyStraightBourbon.com. That'll lead you right to our website. Visit us here in Danville. We're just a small piece off the beaten path down the roads from Four Roses and so on, off of Lebanon Road. And our first bourbons are going to start hitting the market in the spring of next year. We're only going to have a limited release of, we haven't determined the number yet, but it's probably under 50 barrels. So it's going to be scarce, for the next couple of years until 2020, when we'll actually be in our 6th year, and we're looking for a regional full court press.
Awesome. So Shane, thank you again for coming on the show today. For anybody else that wants to learn more about Bourbon Pursuit, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all at Bourbon Pursuit. Also support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/Bourbon Pursuit. And you can help this show grow and bring on more cool guests like Shane to tell his story and everything like that. So with that, if you have any other show suggestions, make sure you send us an email, THEDUO at bourbonpursuit.com. We also take any fan mail you want to send through there. We always love reading that. Also, keep those iTunes reviews coming in. That also helps keep growing the #1 podcast in bourbon and making us continue to be the official podcast of bourbon. So with that, we will see you all next week.